SMC Radio.
What is up? Welcome to my listeners and viewers from across the country, around the world, and intergalactically. You are listening to Sound Museum Collective. My name's E, and I'm here to talk to you about radios. A little bit about how this programming is going to go. We're going to start off by talking about a little bit of the timeline of how radios came to be. We'll talk a little bit about the FCC, some policy, and then we're going to talk about the technical operations of radios, what they are and how they work. So thanks for tuning in. Let's go. So I guess the important thing to know about radios is radios are messages that are sent out or received on particular frequencies. These frequencies are measured, in the case of FM, megahertz. For an AM dial, they're measured in kilohertz. So the broadband in which these frequencies exist is actually limited. It goes from 88 to 108 megahertz. What does that mean? So if you're listening to 103.3 WPRB, you're actually listening to 103,300,000 hertz. And we abbreviate that to 103.3. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the more technical operations of radios. But it's important to note that this broadband is limited because it has a lot to do around with how radio came to be what it is culturally now. So, back up all the way to the beginning of when radios started. Everyone's super stoked. Radio is popping off. Everyone is really enjoying it. This is a cool new tool for communications, for listening to music, disseminating information. Everyone's going wild over the radio. And what ended up happening is, at the time, and actually still today, a lot of transportation communications was also using radio, so ships in particular. And where this started to get complicated is, like I said, that broadband is limited, right? 88 to 108. So there ended up being like a lot of RF interference, radio frequency interference. And that became a problem because all these different sorts of transportations had to use radio to communicate, along with police and the military. Ooh. But so that's when the government said, we have to step in because we can't have all this interference. We can't have people broadcasting on top of these particular communications. So an governmental entity was created, referred to as the FRC, which is the Federal Radio Commission. And they came in and they're like, okay, we have to ensure there aren't all these interferences, and we're going to enforce that by making people apply for a license to be on the radio, and then once you have a license, then you apply for a particular frequency. So what ended up happening is the airwaves became completely monopolized, and that's because this is also, think Great Gatsby, right? Advertising is a whole new thing. Billboards, right? So all these corporations and companies and big nonprofits came along and bought up all the airwaves because they have money and power and could. So then you had the radio shift from this cool community tool to being all commercialized. And you can imagine why that would be problematic. So now we're in the 30s, give or take, and everyone from union workers to educators to public health officials to artists started to come together to be like, this isn't going to work. We demand that there be public radio. And in 1934, the Communications Act was passed, and that's when the FRC became the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. which made sure that there was frequencies that were allotted to community and public radio. And some of this remains true today. Some of the things that define a community radio station is, first of all, it has to be non-commercial. You can't be like selling advertisement slots, and no one can be profiting from the airwaves or from the broadcast. And then also you have to have public service announcements throughout your programming, PSAs, because your station exists in the public interest. So, community radio. So perhaps it goes without saying, but it's worth mentioning anyway, that this was a big deal because people radio is important. We deserve to participate in our own cultural production, and we, for the most part, are all pretty well aware of the fact that major media deeply misrepresents and distorts race, class, gender, dare I even say love in mainstream media, and they do this in the interest of making money. So it's our right to control our narrative and to disseminate localized news and to dictate our own cultural landscape. It's simply unjust to allow these big corporations to monopolize the airwaves and take away something that is such a powerful community tool and has the potential to cultivate new societal pathways, quite honestly. So that was really, and true for today also, about why community radio is just, and public radio is just so important. So a really cool thing that arose out of community public radio is something that's referred to as free format radio, which is defined by its totally erratic programming. You have a huge mixed bag of what is on the air, and we can't really talk about free format radio, I feel like, without mentioning Radio Alice, which is a pirate station that arose out of the autonomous movement in Italy in the late 60s, I believe. And they were unbearably avant-garde, and I feel like there's a lot of academic journals written about what they were doing. But essentially they were trying to use voice to make space for new models of society. And a big thing that they were doing within their free format programming is they were doing call-in radio, which they didn't coin that term. They weren't the first to do it necessarily, but they took it to a whole new extreme. And what's really important about, or significant about that, is that's where you start seeing the blurring of the lines about who is participating in shaping programming when you have all these call-ins happening all the time. And then on top of doing call-in radio and just playing a lot of experimental music and whatnot, they were doing a lot of like spoken word poetry, and they were also doing weird things where they were like, how can we verbally communicate but without using words? So like sometimes there would just be like nonsense, like rambling. But so like I said, they were a pirate station, and what ended up happening is when the police finally came in to shut them down, during the police raid, they actually broadcasted the entire thing on the air. So you could hear the police destroying the station, and you could hear the DJs just yelling, "Help Radio Alice! Help Radio Alice!" Which is also, when we're thinking about blurring the lines between like audience and producer, is also incredibly interesting when you get to participate live in something like that. I also, when we're talking about free format radio, I simply can't be sitting here in Philadelphia without talking about two local stations that were doing the same thing around the same time, which is WFMU, which is 91.1 on your FM dial, which operates out of Orange County, still exists today, which was doing similar things with free format radio, but they were a legal community station. And then also WPRB, which is 103.3 on your radio dial, which operates out of Princeton, New Jersey.